these are drummers from Drums for Life, so we appreciate them for getting this program started. I'm Valeda Fullwood, and I want to welcome you to NGAAP and SHARE Charlotte's 3rd annual Funder and Nonprofit Networking Forum. We appreciate you being here today. We're super excited. I wanted to start out by just acknowledging and paying tribute to a path-breaking sister, Nichelle Nichols, who passed away, the Star Trek actress who opened doors and provided a new vision for all of us. I want to acknowledge that and say that funding equity, the final frontier. This is the forum of SHARE Charlotte and NGAAP, a philanthropic collective. NGAAP's Bold Project, an initiative with Black organizations leading differently, has a multi-year mission to pave a new path in philanthropy, break down barriers, and elevate the voices and vision of Black leaders, to boldly go where few funders have gone before. So we welcome you to today's networking event. We're at the program segment. I hope you had a wonderful opportunity meeting some folks during the networking forum. We have an awesome speaker you'll hear more about shortly. And then afterward, we have a little party, if you will, or a social reception with some food and wine and beer and soft drinks. So wanted to highlight some of our other Black Philanthropy Month events that you may or may not have heard about. Make sure you're aware and mark your calendar if you can attend. So yes, on August 22nd, just next week, we have an event on Martha's Vineyard that will be live streamed. It includes a number of speakers talking about facets of racial equity, how they're working in the philanthropic realm to advance racial equity, whether they're a mayor of a community, whether they lead a national nonprofit, whether they're focused on a local public-private initiative, whether they're part of a giving circle, or whether they lead a foundation. August 26th to the 28th is our weekend edition of CLT Black Gives Black, and if you don't know, that is our big giving day, this time a weekend to give financially in support of Black founded and Black led and Black benefiting nonprofits in our community. If you don't know who to give to, we have a whole room full of folks in here to get to know, and the idea is not to just give that one day, but to begin a relationship and ongoing support and find out how best you can support them financially, as well as through volunteerism, through donation of items, through board service. And then we culminate the month with this event at the Gantt Center on August 3rd. It features author Tyrone McKinley Freeman, who's a professor at Indiana University in their School of Philanthropy. In 2020, he wrote a book on Madam C.J. Walker and the legacy of Black women's philanthropy. And so the event is entitled, If We Had Not Loved Each Other, which is a reference to a James Baldwin reference in one of his essays. And if you're on our email list, you got that in one of the suggested readings for this month. And with that, I'd like to invite one of our partners to the stage, Melissa Hovey, who leads SHARE Charlotte. She will introduce our speaker.
Thank you so much, Valeda, and thank you all for being here. It's so awesome to see everyone in person for this event. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Nathaniel Chioke Williams, today's guest speaker. He's the executive director at the Hill-Snowdon Foundation, a family foundation based in Washington, D.C. Dr. Williams leads Hill-Snowdon's operations, community partnerships, as well as the foundation's philanthropic and programming work. In response to the racial justice uprisings of 2020, Williams is currently leading the development of the Freedom Funders, a philanthropic community of purpose, will, support, and action dedicated to building a philanthropy for Black freedom and liberation. Previously, he was a co-chair and an early leader in the development of Grantmakers for Southern Progress, a network of local, regional, and national funders committed to leveraging resources to help build a vibrant and enduring infrastructure for social justice in the U.S. South. Dr. Williams has over 20 years of funding experience, largely focused on community organizing, youth organizing, Black-led organizing, and social justice organizing in the South. He also served as the Assistant Professor of Black Studies at the SUNY New York Pulse. Dr. Williams holds a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from Morehouse College, as well as a Master of Arts and PhD in Community Psychology from NYU. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Nat Chioke Williams.
How is everyone doing today? Good, good. That's a good-looking room out here. Speaking about good looking, I have to say one thing. Take a little point of immodesty. So I flew into your amazing city, excited to be here. My clothes were excited to be here, but they didn't get here. So I spent the morning traveling through the streets of Charlotte trying to buy this suit. So, just let me Anyway, so yeah, thank you for coming here today. And I want to thank NGAAP, and particularly Valeda and Charles, for inviting me here to speak today. And I'm extremely honored to serve as the keynote speaker for NGAAP's third annual Funder and Nonprofit Networking Forum for Black Philanthropy Month. And so over its 16 years, NGAAP has brought some of the best and brightest thinkers and philanthropic leaders to this community to make the case for prioritizing racial equity as a fundamental principle, practice, and goal for the Charlotte Mecklenburg community. So they were all good, and I was like, what am I gonna do? So I was struggling to come up a little bit with what I was gonna talk about today, and what would be novel, what would be a good contribution in this lineage from 16 years of this type of work. And so to get some inspiration, I took a look at the invitation that NGAAP sent out. And tucked meekly at the very bottom of the invitation was this little line. You probably didn't even see it. It said, imagine the possibilities if together we even the playing field. And I started saying that again in my mind. I said, imagine the possibilities if together we even the playing field. And so that's what I did. I started to imagine. And I started to see what that felt like and what it could be like. And I also got excited with the prospect of combining two of the things that are closest to my heart: social justice and science fiction. So anyone who knows me knows that I'm a huge science fiction and fantasy fan. Movies, comic books, anime, you name it, I'm into it, I always have been. And so what fascinates me so much about this genre is the wonder of envisioning and imagining worlds that do not yet exist, but that could exist. And so my absolute favorite show of all time is The Twilight Zone. We got any Twilight Zone fans out there? Come on, somebody else. Okay, anyway. So I love The Twilight Zone. The uber cool Rod Serling, with his velvety baritone voice, tantalizing prose in the beginning, and the ever-present cigarette, so they can't do that today, but trying to move people into this array of poignant possibilities and imagination. And so in a nod to Twilight Zone, I did not coordinate this with Valeda, with the boldly go Star Trek thing. I actually have, my speech for today is entitled The Fifth Dimension, the Imaginative Freedom of Racial Equity. And so I don't know if, for all the Twilight Zone fans in there, even if you're not a fan, you probably know the opening monologue a little bit about it. So I think actually that opening monologue is a great allegory for how I think about racial equity. All right, so y'all gonna come with me for a second? All right, let me get you in the mood. All right, get the voice. There is a fifth dimension, beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is a dimension of imagination. It's an area which we call the Twilight Zone. Yeah, that was my part. Anyway, all right, so let's break down this monologue within the context of racial equity. So there's a fifth dimension, beyond that which is known to man. So racial equity is something that has never existed in our reality or history. It is literally a dimension of human experience that is that which is not known to man. And in its absence, we know what is all too well known to us, what has been here, which is structural violence, oppression, and dehumanization of people of color, and the anxiety-filled, misbegotten, and illegitimate sense of superiority bestowed upon white people in this pernicious system of white supremacy that we all live under. And this system rewards complacency and complicity and convinces us to focus on individual and immediate comforts rather than our own collective futures. And the pervasiveness and perpetuity of this vicious reality shuts down our ability to know and often even imagine another way of being. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. Racial equity, to me, is the middle ground, the bridge, the passageway between the shadowy stain of racial oppression and the light of freedom, between the superstitions that justify our divisions and the hard truth that we all need each other to thrive, between the depths of man's fears and anxiety and the height of our collective potential and greatness. And if we truly open our eyes, we can clearly see the depths to which we've sunken because of racial inequity and white supremacy. And because we wallow in these depths, we cannot even begin to imagine the soaring heights that we could attain if we but choose to commit ourselves to a truly just, equitable, humane, and free society and way of being. It is a dimension as vast as space, as timeless as infinity. This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call, and I'll take some license here, the racial equity zone, all right? As human beings, our greatest and most unique gift and strength is our imagination. The capacity to envision a reality that is not only different from our current reality, but that should not even be conceivable given our current conditions. Our imagination is where we can experience freedom, even as our bodies are shackled to a brutal reality of our past and present. At the core of this imaginative freedom is a hope for the future. And this is ultimately what you're doing when you do racial equity work. You are working with and working towards a hope for an unimaginably better, more prosperous, peaceful, and glory-filled future. So if we truly created the racially equitable future that I can envision, then we would be able to build a world that is the stuff of science fiction. Our potential for creativity would be boundless. Our lives would be filled with a peace only realized through harmonious coexistence, and we would attain true freedom of mind, body, spirit, and soul. And so let's just stop for a moment. I'm going to invite you to close your eyes and wonder, and let your mind wander at what the world could be like if we all supported and nurtured, if we were all supported and nurtured to be our greatest and most fulfilled selves. If we lived in a society where the highest value was to work for the betterment of each other and our future. Can you imagine that? Can y'all feel that? Can y'all see that? Imagine how we could have been thriving as a country and society if we didn't suppress the talents and opportunities for Black people and other people of color just to maintain a false racial hierarchy. Imagine what we could have achieved in science and art and philosophy, every discipline imaginable. Imagine what we could have built, what we could have invented, what we could have achieved as a nation. Imagine what our lives could have been like if we were not bound to this dehumanizing system of white supremacy and anti-Black structural racism, and we were free to be our true and full selves. Thank you. You're good. So with an eye towards this imaginative freedom that I envision for a racially equitable society, I offer for your consideration this definition of racial equity. That's up there. So I would define racial equity as the vastness of human possibility and potential liberated from white supremacy, and born of the freedom to be our true and full selves. Let me just say that again. I know you've been reading it for the last 2 minutes, but I want to say it again. The vastness of human possibility and potential, liberated from white supremacy, and born of the freedom to be our true and full selves. So I offer this definition as an important and evocative complement to the commonly cited definition of racial equity as, you can go to the next one, thank you, the condition that would be achieved if one's racial identity no longer predicted, in a statistical sense, how one fares in society. So it's a great definition, but it's not as good as the one I gave you, right? Anyway, so, no, this definition offers a critically important and unassailable level of accountability to measure progress towards ameliorating racial inequity. Its focus on real-time outcomes-based data is its greatest strength, but it also points to some limitations in the current definition. So firstly, the mere statistical absence of racial inequity does not evoke, at least for me, a vision for how the world would be transformed if we eliminated racial inequities and dismantled white supremacy. Racially speaking, we would have all of our glasses half full, but this definition does not give us the sense of the flavor, the color, the texture, and of the nature and the liquid that would be our sustenance, and it doesn't even tell you kind of what the shape and what the form of the glass is that's holding the liquid. In other words, freedom is not merely the absence of oppression, and racial equity is not merely the elimination of racial inequities. In its fullness, racial equity is a new way of being in a vast universe of new possibilities, generated by the eradication of the life-sucking, soul-shrinking, possibility-paralyzing yoke of racial oppression. Secondly, this definition may provide only minimal motivation to and an over-reliance on the good graces, guilt, or other episodic compulsions of those in power to take actions to eliminate racial inequity. The moral outrages that we've seen, such as the brutal murder of George Floyd, these can momentarily compel us to have an interest and take action, but tend not to sustain the abiding commitment and commensurate sacrifice that will need to be done to achieve racial equity long term. As those with white skin privilege have been conditioned to see non-whites as the other, and as this society reifies individuality, AKA self-centeredness, the inevitable question for the white ruling class is, why should I help you have a better life at my expense, right? Or, simply put, what's in it for me, right? So I believe this question reveals the unspoken black ceiling that explains why the racial equity efforts of people of goodwill but complicit privilege are often incomplete half measures and not commensurate with the actual need. But this question of what's in it for me is a legitimate question that needs to be addressed. However, we cannot address it until we first understand the scope of what has been lost and for whom as a result of white supremacy, anti-black structural racism, and racial inequity. So when we think about racial inequity and injustice, we think about people of color who suffer under a system of white supremacy. And that's correct, because people of color are the targets and suffer the most due to white supremacy. Nevertheless, we should also acknowledge that the system of white supremacy is universally destructive and dehumanizes, constricts, and represses white people as well, as it attempts to do the same to people of color. White supremacy is small, it's short-sighted, scared, and fatalistic. And although many people may benefit materially from it, it ultimately is doomed to fail under the crushing weight of its inadequacy, its impotence, and its enmity. The reality is that we are all bound by and bound to the system of white supremacy and anti-black structural racism, and it dehumanizes and objectifies all of us, preventing us from fully embracing our core humanity, severely limiting our ability to reach our full potential as individuals and a society overall. So for example, look how constricted and stunted we are in our personal growth and development, particularly when it comes to discussing racism. The apprehension and the discomfort that many white people feel and black people feel when directly talking and thinking about racism is proof of the chains that bind them to a system based on anti-black structural racism. It triggers a perpetual flight or flight syndrome of anxiety, fear, guilt, and psychic distress that is sublimated through avoidance, denial, displaced anger, and attempts to whitewash and control black people's freedom of expression, and in many cases, revise history. So case in point, the whole overhyped, politically motivated outrage over critical race theory is literally an attempt to protect white people from feeling bad about the brutal truth of racial oppression in this country. This is but one example of the tremendous amount of psychic, emotional, political, and social energy that is expended to protect white people's ego and self-image under this system of white supremacy. But in a different world, in a world that I can imagine, I hope that you are able to start imagining. Imagine the good that could be created with all that energy if white people were free of the dehumanizing burden of white supremacy and joined their newly unfettered energy, creativity, and power with the unfettered energy, creativity, and power of the rest of humanity in harmony for the benefit of us all. And with all that energy, with all that creativity and goodwill, we could eradicate hunger and poverty, we could reverse the climate crisis, we could cure heretofore incurable diseases, create technological wonders, and live in true peace. So, going back to the question, why should you commit to racial equity? What's in it for you? Simply put, your future. A future of unimaginable possibility, inner peace and harmony, and the freedom to be your true self. So if this possibility of this future resonates with you, let me offer some recommendations for how we can be the caretakers of today of a racially equitable future tomorrow. Or as I like to say, how we can live like it's $21.99. All right? Cool. Can you put up the next slide, please? All right, so I have 5 recommendations. Okay, we don't have that one. Great. So you know what you're gonna have to do? You're gonna have to imagine it's up there, all right? All right, so I have 5 recommendations for all of y'all, with a particular focus on some of the funders in the room, but this is, again, more universal. So the first recommendation is to nurture your imaginative freedom. You could start by envisioning that up on the screen right now. Anyway, so you have to develop a discipline. Imagination, particularly in the way that we are in and with each other today, it is something that's stunted. It is something that is not fully accessible to us. And so it's not as simple as saying, oh, imagine a better future. It has to be a discipline. It has to be a practice that you have to cultivate. And part of that practice is also cultivating the belief in a racially equitable future. So imagine a future, and work with me here, go with me here. Imagine a future where we are all freed from the emotional burden, the physical pain, the social constrictions, and limitations of racism and white supremacy. Imagine what your community would look like, what your life could be like, what your life would look like in your family. What does it look like? What does it feel like to you? What are you free to do? How are you free to be with yourself and with others? And as you imagine this, pay attention to what it feels like in your body. So it's not just imagining freedom, it's embodying the imaginative freedom. And really sink into what racial equity and freedom feels like. Because this vision and these feelings are what you have to cultivate in order to carry this with you, because you will need sustenance, you will need something to continue to motivate you, because this is hard work. And everything around you is going to be trying to lead you in a different path. And so once you fortify yourself with this imagination, once you fortify yourself with the depth of feeling, once you can really embody it, then you can start to imagine and you can start to live today the joy of a racially equitable world. So, first one, nurture your imaginative freedom. Second recommendation, the answer to how is yes. Or commit first, then find the way. So often as funders, as bankers, as organizational leaders, we pride ourselves on being strategic, thoughtful, and pragmatic people. And this often puts us in a position of being overly skeptical to new things, especially if they seem risky or we have trouble imagining them and imagining how they will work. So we often find ourselves asking the question, how? And this question quickly becomes an imaginative sinkhole. But as author Peter Block says in the title of his book, The Answer to How is Yes, in other words, what we have to do in approaching the question of how is to first make a commitment and then free yourself and others to find the solutions. So we as leaders, we are at our absolute best when we begin to reach for that which does not exist and that which we can barely imagine. And this takes faith, it takes trust, and a capacity to think, imagine, and act abundantly. And that is often as simple as first saying yes, especially when it comes to racial equity. So, yes. Come on. Yes. Okay, and one more time. Yes. Very good. All right, great. So that's the first step. You have to say yes and then let the solutions come to you. You have to take the risks and stay the course over what will definitely be a long and what definitely has been a long and bumpy road, to say the least. But if we don't do this, we risk losing so much more. And we risk losing our futures and the best futures we can be. And as I like to say, vigilance is the only victory. So, third recommendation, take action like your future depends on it because it does. So for funders, which I am, I've been doing this about 22 years, saying yes basically means giving money. I spend most of my day saying no. And the times when I say yes, it's because I'm embracing a particular openness to folks. And so when I ask the funders in the room to say yes to racial equity, I'm asking you to give some more money, specifically for racial equity. But this has to be so much more than the performative, reactionary, I gave at the office or feel good giving that so often characterizes philanthropic giving towards racial equity. As I said earlier, this type of giving, this feel-good type of giving, is often grounded in a belief that you are given to benefit someone other than yourself. The deserving or undeserving poor, however you want to say that, the vulnerable, the marginalized. But in reality, giving to racial equity is about ensuring the best and brightest future for your community, your family, and yourself. It may not come to fruition for decades from now, but that's why it should be thought of not as given, but investment in the future and funding your legacy. And it has to be done at a level that's commensurate with the need, which is a fancy way of saying go big and then go bigger until the job is done. So that was for funders talking about giving. I was talking to myself more or less. But so for nonprofit leaders, there's also something you can do to take action for the future. And taking action for the future might mean cultivating your imaginations to see the larger picture and living more abundantly in the future now. So the rat race for funding, for prestige, that is a part of the nonprofit industrial complex, forces competition, not collaboration, consternation, not cooperation. And so, however, if you can cultivate a strong vision of a brighter, more abundant future, and let this be your guide, then maybe we can all collaborate and share resources with other organizations. We could push back against the forces that try to pit us against one another. We can strengthen existing work in organizations and join with each other to realize the possibilities that we are all working towards. All right, that was 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. Seed opportunity, so seed with an S, opportunity, and seed power, C-E-D-E. So at the core of my definition and vision for racial equity is helping to unleash the full potential, creativity, and brilliance of those who suffer the brunt of racial inequities in order to forge a better tomorrow. In practice, this includes seeding, with an S, opportunities for growth, development, repair, and restoration by robust investment in people of color, in communities of color, as well as removing barriers to growth, development, and access. This also means, though, that power needs to be seeded with a C and shared. Decision-making and authority for racially marginalized communities has to be seeded to these communities so that we can help shape our own futures and determine our futures. And the denial to do this, the denial for communities of color to have a real say in their futures, is a fundamental strategy in maintaining our collective marginalization and in producing the very racial inequities that we are talking about today. So seeding, with a C, and authentically sharing decision-making power is critical for developing grounded, effective, and essential solutions to racial inequity, as those who are most impacted by these issues have the lived experience to develop the best remedies. That's a core of a principle that we support in terms of community organizing. Those who are most impacted by the solutions are the ones who have to develop the solutions. By the issues have to be the ones to develop the solutions. So for instance, as I said, I was tooling around your city today looking for a suit, but I also did some research before I came here on all the amazing things that you really are doing in this city. And so the mayor's $250 million racial equity initiative is a good example of investing in or seeding, with an S, efforts to combat racial inequities. And so y'all should all be applauded for that. That is really important. I don't know much about the inner workings of the MREI, but I would be curious to see how the mayor's office and the private investors seeded, with a C, power or shared decision-making authority in the design, the implementation, and the evaluation of the initiative with local Black leaders and community residents who are the targets and who would be the beneficiaries of these initiatives. So it's important to seed opportunity, but it's necessary to seed power and authority. As I mentioned, this is often a vital aspect of developing grounded solutions to racial inequities, and it helps ensure that investments and plans are aligned with actual community needs as expressed by the community, rather than what might be less proximate solutions and perhaps more politically comfortable and palatable solutions. And seeding and sharing power, because I'm just going to say it one more time, is an essential strategy to advance racial equity, as the racial inequities are the direct byproducts of a long history and a system that hoarded power, privilege, and decision-making authority for white people at the expense of Black people. So seed, S, seed, C. And then finally, give Black. At the root of it all, you need to commit to investing deeply in Black-led organizations in the Charlotte, Mecklenburg community. These are the organizations on the front line of working to ensure the growth, development, and progress for the Black community in Charlotte and the surrounding areas. And through their efforts, they will help ensure this better, brighter, racially equitable future I've been discussing today. I'm sure the situation here in Charlotte, Mecklenburg area is similar to the rest of the country, and that Charlotte's Black-led organizations are probably under-resourced, underappreciated, and therefore underdeveloped based on, compared to where they could be and compared to what is necessary. The Association of Black Funding Executives did a study a few years ago and found that 1.8% of philanthropic dollars nationally go to Black-led organizations. 1.8% of philanthropic dollars goes specifically to support Black communities. And so I know y'all doing better than that here, right? Okay, I don't know. Anyway, I hope you are. I hope y'all are. But whether you are or you're not, we all can agree that that is woefully insufficient, and it's woefully inadequate, and is not commensurate with the needs, not only for today, but for our future. And so when you're talking about Black-led organizations, it's important to also define what that is. And so NGAAP has, I think, a pretty good definition that can help you do that. This three-pronged definition that talks about Black benefiting, so that, that the organization specifically is for the benefit of the Black community, Black founded, that is founded by Black people and from the Black and African diaspora, and also that it is Black-led. And so that 50% of the staff, of the executive leadership is from the African diaspora or self-identifies as Black. And that's actually the same definition we used for the case for funding Black social change that my colleague and I, Susan Taylor Batten from AFRI, wrote in 2016. So I can vouch for it. Anyway, so there are hundreds of these organizations in the Charlotte Mecklenburg community. And you have groups like NGAAP and the newly formed Funders Collaborative on Racial Equity, as well as people in this room to just reach out to and get to know, to learn more about these groups and to strategize around how to develop racially equitable and necessary investment and grant-making strategies. So, in conclusion, how long I've been up here? I don't know. Anyway, in conclusion, so another better, brighter world and future is possible. One that is thriving because it nurtures and benefits from the unfettered and unleashed potential and talents of all its people. This is what a racially equitable future looks like. And it may seem like a perilous and unimaginable journey given where we are today, but first thing you have to do, see, this is a quiz. This is the quiz part. First thing you have to do is say yes. Yeah, there you go. That actually worked. I don't believe it. Anyway, first thing you have to do is, yes, say yes to this future and commit fully. And believe in and support Black organizations and groups like NGAAP that can help you chart the course there. NGAAP is literally standing in the gap between where you are right now and a more just and racially equitable future. And in that future, again, it's not just about the conditions that we see on the ground, it's about how we feel in ourselves to be free and to live out our fullest potential and possibilities. So trust in NGAAP, trust in local Black leaders and Black people, believe in their vision, trust in their talents, accept their partnerships, and follow their lead. And together, you will free your imaginations to dream, and I'm gonna have to steal from you later, boldly go towards the future that we all need and deserve. So thank you for your time today, I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for those powerful words, those wise words. And so at this time, you guys can hear me pretty well, right? So at this time, we're going to do a Q&A, open it up for some questions and answers. I'll kick it off. So good evening, everybody. My name is Charles Thomas. I am the program director for the Knight Foundation, and I'm also a proud member of the new generation of African-American philanthropists, have been so since 2011. And just thrilled by tonight's program and by the wonderful words of Nat. And so just a couple questions for you to get started, and then I'm going to turn it over to you all. So I'm a sci-fi head. I love the whole analogy and the theme around the Twilight Zone and Star Trek. Big fan of Michelle. So I'm curious. I've got like 3 questions. So I'm going to do my best because I want to open up.
I think you may need the mic so they can get it. Is that what you're trying to tell them?
Oh.
He's the mic? Okay, yeah.
All right. Testing. Great.
There we go.
All right, thank you. So I'm curious, I think one general question I have is around Hill-Snowdon's journey. If you could just give a few of us just a snapshot of your journey towards advancing racial equity as a foundation or your personal journey. And then I want to ask you about a couple of your 5 recommendations that you left with us.
Sure. So let's see. So I've been at the Hill-Snowdon Foundation as the executive director for the disgustingly long period of 18 years. And the foundation, though, has existed for 65 years. So for about 40 plus of those years, it was what they called a typical family foundation. I don't have a family foundation. That's not typical to me. But anyway, a typical family foundation where they would get together, around Thanksgiving or Christmas and write checks to organizations they heard of or knew of in their community. For those 40 years, it was really informal. It was mostly for scholarship programs, for mentorship programs, after-school programs, young people, right? Made sense. In the late 90s, there was an infusion of dollars into the organization, and so they decided to partner with the Tides Foundation in California, which is specifically a social justice-based foundation and kind of fiscal sponsor. And through that, the family started to recognize that the need to have an after-school program, the need to have mentorship programs, the need to address some of the challenges they were seeing were sometimes at the surface and not at the root of what was actually leading towards these manifestations. And so they stepped back and said, okay, so how do we get to the root cause? And what they said fundamentally is that the root cause was that it was the lack of power, the lack of the ability for these communities, and in the case where we started with youth organizing, for young people to have a say, and a real say, in determining their own futures. And so once you start going down that path of recognizing that there needs to be greater shared decision-making, there needs to be greater shared power, there needs to be, in many ways, a reinvigorated sense of democracy, right? Because that's what we're supposed to, that's what democratic participation and structure is really supposed to be about. Once you start going down that path, then everything leads you to the place of racial equity. You have no opportunity to turn anywhere else. And so that's what we've been doing for a number of years, but we also are trying to specifically target and lift up the need to support Black-led social justice organizations, because just like Black-led nonprofits, say in the service sector, wherever, just across the board, Black-led organizations have been under-resourced for decades.
So thank you for that. And that leads into what my second question is which is around the seeding power with the C. So again, we're all doing our best to imagine. I work for a foundation. It has all these rules, all the way things need to be. And so this is something that we're talking about at the Funder Collaborative here in Charlotte that's focused on racial equity, is how, like, if you could give some more examples of what seeding power looks like if maybe some tactics that, and I apologize, this is more of a funder maybe question, but what are just some examples that some of us as funders can think about and look up, think about how do we really turn over power? Because that's a donor, folks that, what the donors want and all these different rules.
Right.
How do we seed power?
So just as a resource for folks in the room, if you don't already know about it, there's an organization called the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. And so over the last several years, folks from the Whitman Institute that recently spent down have been kind of leading this charge to figure out how to develop a philanthropy that's based on trust and to, again, provide some equity and some equalization in the power hierarchy between funders and grantees. But one of the, so that's the, trust-based philanthropy, I think is .org or something like that. But you can look that up. They have a whole bunch of, they have a theory, they have all these things. It's great. But one of the things that we do, sometimes it's small, sometimes it's large. So language is important, and the disposition that comes with that is more important. We don't use the term grantees when we talk about our partners. We use grassroots partners. And something as simple as that little shift in language, if you embody what that actually means, if they are actually a partner, then what does a partner mean? If they are a grantee, y'all know what that means, right? But what does it mean to be in partnership with folks who are there? And then, like, when I go on site visits, I just did some in Raleigh-Durham the last couple of days. I always start off by saying this. I was like, one, we as a foundation and philanthropic sector would not exist if it was not for y'all. So many times, we flip a script, like, we're up in this, like, on the hill and, we're granting down, but absolutely, we would not have jobs. Like, we would have no purpose, if it wasn't for the groups who are doing the work on the ground. And so more often than not, and I could talk for myself, I took this job because I knew I couldn't do your job, right? But I still wanted to figure out a way to be supportive. And so doing the things that kind of reassess and realign the correct kind of respect and the correct level of gratitude are really important. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff you can do outside of that.
Perfect. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
Yes. Thank you for meeting me. I'm pregnant with triplets, so I appreciate you letting me sit here. My name is Adrienne Threet. I am an NGAAP member and also founder of Hope Vibes, Inc., a Black-serving nonprofit here in the city. You mentioned that only 1.8% of philanthropic dollars go to Black-founded, Black-led, Black-serving nonprofits, and you mentioned some of the effects of that. I was wondering if there are any indicators from research as to what's the cause of why that number is so low.
So you can't look at the philanthropic sector and the nonprofit sector as separate and apart from the world that we live in, right? And so I think the ways that it gets communicated in practice is with an extra level of skepticism. It's like, oh, so can you manage this money, Black organization, right? Like, where are your metrics, Black organization? And all this sounds perfectly justifiable. Like, well, I just asked them some questions about what they do. They're not asking those same questions to white-led organizations in the same way. You know what I'm saying? And so yeah, we could talk about data, we could talk about those things, but fundamentally, it's about trust, belief, and as I was saying somewhere in the very long speech that I just gave, that there's a fundamental conundrum that organizations, foundations, and you can talk about this like progressive foundations too, that are supposed to be all about racial equity and racial justice, are they really? Like, would they really give up their power in a racially equitable world? Because what I talked about, yeah, it was all, traipsing through the rose bushes and stuff, but someone's gonna have to give up something, right? Things are gonna have to be different. There's gonna be pain, there's gonna be sacrifice. And are people really willing to do that? Are they trying to maintain the status quo and then sometimes, like I said, perform and feel good about it? So it may not be a specific direct question to your answer to your question, but I do think that the burdens that are put upon Black organizations and Black-led organizations are so much greater because of the skepticism, the animus, the distrust that is engendered in this society due to white superiority and white supremacy, that's the answer.
Another question?
Thank you. My name is Henry Rock, founder of City Startup Labs. And I want to deal with this seed piece that you gave us. And I'm curious to know, how do we seed the opportunity for organizations that typically are siloed to work together,
Yep.
right? And then also, how do we seed, with the C, those very silos that cause us to want to uphold the very work that we're doing, so that we can maintain our institutions and so forth and so on, which oftentimes gets in the way of us really doing the good work.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a big question. And so I'm going to give you some very simplistic and inadequate answers for your big and very good question. So one thing to do is, so the nonprofit sector, which is organized basically by philanthropy, meaning that the way we cut up our work in the nonprofit sector is based on the structure that's imposed by philanthropy. So you have a project here, you're doing this, you're doing that. And we talk about, within the Hill-Snowdon Foundation, kind of that people are not divided up into issues or sectors. They're people, right? So you have to look at it holistically. That's not what you have the ability to do as being a leader in a nonprofit, because foundations dictate the terms, frankly, of your existence, right? And so if you recognize that, then you also may recognize that you're not going, that the work that you have to do to form those connections, to seed the opportunities to come together, may have to be done outside of the 9 to 5, right? May have to be done outside of the funded work that you are there to do, because that work is in your interest, right? Coming together, working together, figuring out the solutions that you need for your own community, that's in your interest, not the funder's interest, right? And I also think that the other part of it, the seed and power, it's, I'm sorry, I'm from Brooklyn, that's just but that fundamentally, I think there's also ego and prestige in this whole thing too, right? And some of it's survival, like you're trying to like make sure that your community survive, you're trying to make sure you can pay your staff, you keep the bills paid. But a large portion of it also is ego too. If you are that lucky enough to be those who are chosen to come sit at the table, you're not trying to give up that seat. You know what I'm saying? And so the seed in power is not only from, say, white philanthropy or whatever, it's also within yourself. You have to seed your own ego often. But the reason why you're doing it, what's in it for you, why should you do something different in your life for somebody else, is for your collective future, right? But you got to be in relationship with people in order to actually see that future and build it together. So I don't know if that's helpful. All right, cool.
Hi, I'm Madeline McClinney, president and founder of ExodusFoundation.org, and our mission is to stop the flow of African Americans to prison. And I started out besides the church, at the Council on Foundations. I have a comment and a question. At that time in '93, the statistic about giving to the black nonprofit community was like at 0.5%. So in 20-something years, it hasn't shifted much. My question is, since I founded Exodus, we mentor people coming out of prison. You talk about trust and risk. How would you advise groups that work with people that are considered the lepers of society, right? But so first you got to get the trust interpersonally, and then the people that you're serving are so distrusted and mistrusted. And if it's 18 and up, then that's a whole nother level, because people are like, well, these are adults. They don't need help now, and many of them grew up in prison. So you've got decades of what suggestion do you have to groups like ours that face those extra hurdles?
Right. So the one of the main tactics of white supremacy is, in any kind of colonization and colonial practice, right, is to divide people into different camps, to keep them separated, and then keep them fighting one another so that they don't turn their eyes towards who they should be fighting, right? And so I think within a system of white supremacy, what I'm talking about, like we all are bound by it and we're all dehumanized by it, the way that you start to do that is that you foster relationships with people, right? That you, formerly incarcerated people are not defined by that experience, right? You know, that they are, and that's why folks in the formerly incarcerated and returning citizens movement don't talk about convicted people. Well, the convicted or the felons, because if it stops there and you don't also understand the people, the person within that, then you're always going to objectify them, right? And so one of the things that we try to do within the Hill-Snowdon Foundation is I spend a lot of time with my board just going out and doing site visits and building relationships with the folks that we support. Now, I'm not suggesting that everybody does that, because you got to be in the right mind, you know, before to do that authentically. But the fundamental piece of it is that you have to rebuild the bonds of humanity and connection with people, and that is only through actually being in relationship with them, and figuring out where you find those places of intersection and commonality, because it's always there, right? And the first thing you have to do with that is what? Say yes. Ah, thank you. So you have to commit to doing that. And the people who are with you have to commit to doing that, and then you will see what happens. But I'm not trying to play those platitudes like that, because I know it's extremely hard. And, but that's why you're there, right? That's why you're doing the work that you're doing.
So we're coming up on time, and so but we're going to continue the conversation. If you could pass the microphone.
This way?
I know there are a couple more questions. I know we're just getting warmed up. But we're going to continue the conversation when we go out into the reception area. And so I have 3 questions for you to consider as you go out and you continue to connect with your colleagues, as well as you, if you have a chance to come speak with Nat. So as you're mingling, think about, you know, when you imagine a 5th dimension, what's one thing you see? So when you imagine a 5th dimension, what is something you see or you feel? And then ask this of each other. And then what's one thing you could do more of to help manifest a racially equitable community? One thing you can do more of. And then what's one thing you might stop doing to help manifest a racial equitably community? So hold those questions about what would you imagine, what does it feel like in the 5th dimension, what could you do to advance racial equity, and what could you stop doing to advance racial equity? So with that, I want to say thank you to Nat. And here's a little gift from NGAAP. Thank you so much. And more to come, right? And then I'm going to turn the microphone over to Nat for closing remarks. And then after that, I think we go out into the reception.
Yeah, well, okay, I guess I can do this, right? Okay. Well, thank you all again. I appreciate you taking the time. This is the first time that I've been in Charlotte proper. Like, I'm always in the airport. And like I said, I've toured your malls, so I know there's a lot to, anyway. So one of the things that I'm particularly grateful for being here, and Valeda was talking to me about all of the amazing programming that NGAAP is doing for Black Philanthropy Month and has done over these years, 16 years. Like, I have a 13-year-old daughter, right? Her next big birthday is 16, so I know how big a deal that is. So I just want to give NGAAP a round of applause for 16 years. So yes, I've been impressed with what NGAAP has done over these 16 years from what I've been researching and seeing, and what they aspire to see and manifest in Charlotte, what the possibilities are. And NGAAP's role as a Black philanthropic collective and fierce advocate for funding equity in this city is crucial. And as I said, they're the leaders that you need to trust and rely on. And so for its 16th anniversary, Sweet 16, NGAAP set a quiet goal of generating $160,000 to seed future work for its BOLD project. And in just 2 months, their goal is within reach. I don't know how close it is, but it's you can touch it, almost, right? So NGAAP has attracted $110,000 through contributions from members and non-members alike. Wells Fargo is one of the leading contributors, as with the Knight Foundation and others. So on their behalf, I will say thank you to that. And that seems like pretty good company to be in. So the Hill-Snowdon Foundation would like to join with the funders and supporters of NGAAP's in celebrating Sweet 16, and we'll make a commitment of $10,000 to this amazing organization that has done so much for this community here. And the $10,000, if you do that 5 times, if somebody else steps up another 5, 10, 10, 10, 10, that will get them to their goal from 110 to 160. So this is a friendly challenge for folks to join with the good company that is here, with the community here, and to not only imagine, but to start to seed, with an S, this racial equitable future that you're all aspiring to. So thank you, and look forward to connecting with you all later.
What'd you say?